Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club, where Joseph Pierce, Vivian Dudo, and I will speak again about Chesterton's wonderful book, In Defense of Sanity, the best essay of G.K. Chesterton. We are traveling slowly through this book, but enjoyably, because there's so much to comment on for each essay. We are now on page 225 with the essay Magic and Fantasy in Fiction. And when I read this the first time, I said, okay, I'm going to let Vivian and Joseph talk about this because they're the literate persons who know a lot about literature. But I read it again this morning, and actually there's more in than there's literature, and especially I would summarize it by saying the Mass is not magic. But I would like the two of you to carry on a conversation about this, and let me listen.
Well, I'll defer to Vivian in the first instance.
Well, since defining our terms is so important, as we've all pointed out on other occasions, let's look at what Chesterton says magic is. And on page 225, in the middle there, the word magic was widely used as a term of abuse because it was really a question of abuse in more senses than one. Magic was the abuse of preternatural powers by lower agents whose work was preternatural but not supernatural. It was founded on that profound maxim of Diabolus simius Dei, the devil is the ape of God. Magic was a monkey trick of imitation of the divine functions, and there was therefore nothing stranger in either the similarity or the dissimilarity. But to talk of the higher mysteries or miracles as forms of magic, back to Father's point about the Mass, is to reverse the whole story. It is as if we were to say that the Black Mass gradually evolved into the Mass, and so on. So this idea that magic is actually an abuse of powers not belonging to the people abusing it. And I wondered, Fathers, maybe you could help us out with some of these terms like preternatural, supernatural, and
well, yes, supernatural means above any nature, and only God is supernatural, and we become supernatural by participating through adoption in His life. But only God is totally above all natures. But between us as humans and God, there are other natures which are not natural in terms of our nature, created nature, human nature, and not supernatural, but preternatural, beyond the natural. Preter means beyond or above, and so angels are preternatural, and they're the only preternatural beings which we know about, but probably the only ones. That is pure spiritual beings, no bodies. And of course, angels come in two classes. Well, they come in 9 choirs, of course, but 2 classes. One, those who remain faithful to God, and those who opposed and rejected God, whom we call devils. Or fallen angels. So his point is that we human beings may be tempted to either pretend we're God or to actually use real powers that are beyond our nature, like satanic powers, in order to gain control on things which you shouldn't have control over. Is that?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay.
What would you like to add to that, Joseph?
Well, first thing I would say is that I highlighted exactly the same passage as you just read from page 225. But I wanted to comment on the frustration I feel that there's no overlap between Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis. Lewis's first book, first literary book, Progress Regress, was published a year after this, but there's no evidence of Chesterton ever reading any Lewis. And of course, The Hobbit was published a year after Chesterton died. But what I find very interesting is that Chesterton's discussion of magic here is very similar to the way that Lewis and Tolkien understand magic in the cosmos and therefore in their sub-created worlds. So this is exactly why that Tolkien says that we should not consider elves to be magic or hobbits to be magic, even though we might use that word. It's an inappropriate word because the correct word for magic is basically this definition that Chesterton's giving here.
I loved also his exploration of the meaning of the word enchantment.
Yes.
And how, well, before he gets into enchantment, he points out, okay, so magic is the abuse of preternatural powers and aping God's power, trying to ape God's power. And vis-a-vis human beings, there's a deception going on here, right? That through magic, we're like God. In fact, we're just trying to imitate him, but in doing so, we're abusing ourselves and others in the natural order. And that this leads to what? It leads to slavery. And Chesterton nails that and then says that enchantment, even though the word has become, I'm enchanted to meet you and this kind of thing,
right.
Enchanté, the French say.
Some enchanted evening.
Yeah, all of that, okay. But really, if you look at enchantment in the old stories, right, it means to be a captive. If you're under some kind of enchantment or spell, you're like that fairy story of the swans who are actually brothers, or they're now forced to be into a form that is not their own, and they're enslaved or entrapped, and that miracle, it's the opposite of magic or enchantment, because the miracles performed by Christ freed the person from some kind of bondage, whether bondage to illness or bondage to evil spirits or whatever. So I just thought this was such a brilliant essay, so illuminating.
Yeah, and I think that what you've just said, summarizing and encapsulating what Chesterton says, I think is actually encapsulated by Chesterton himself in the final 10 or so lines, beginning at the bottom of page 230, the conclusion of the essay. The magician is the man when he seeks to become a god, and being a usurper can hardly fail to be a tyrant. Not being the maker, but only the distorter, he twists all things out of their intended shape and imprisons natural things in unnatural forms. But the mass is exactly the opposite of a man seeking to be a god. It is a god seeking to be a man. It is God giving his creative life to mankind as such and restoring the original pattern of their manhood, making not gods, nor beasts, nor angels, but by the original blast and miracle that makes all things new, turning men into men. I mean, absolutely.
I underlined that too, because that's a beautiful summary, of what he said here. Is that
yes,
that there's two kinds of magic. We try and handle God, or God actually comes to be one of us.
Yeah, I mean, in the first half, there is again very much in harmony with characters such as Sauron and Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. I mean, there's definitely a dovetailing of Tolkien and Chesterton in their understanding of magic. But I love turning men into men in their understanding that Jesus, of course, that Christ is the perfect man. So insofar as we become Christ-like, we actually become more fully human. So it's absolutely, yes, it's a marvelous way of ending a marvelous essay.
And it's so important, particularly now, of course, the trends we're seeing, as we've seen in so many of these essays, the trends that Chesterton was noting are the same things that we have now, only more so. And so the trend in especially children's literature to make magic seem as though it's a neutral force that can be used for either good or evil. So now the only thing that matters is your intention, not that you're actually grasping at powers that you've got no business playing around with. And that this has led to all kinds of confusion in the minds of young people. And even worse than that, our local exorcists will tell you that some of the trouble they're seeing among young people is that they've been dabbling in black arts because of the encouragement they've gotten for this from various entertainments for kids. And they end up, enslaved to something and need the sacramental power of the church through Christ's power to get out.
You two, you're both parents, and you're both literate in the sense of being well versed in literature, I would like you to comment on 3 different literary works: Lord of the Rings. What's Rowland's thing?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, and then the third thing is that the guy who was purposely satanic.
Oh, Pullman.
Philip Pullman, The Golden Compass, and that sort of thing.
Right.
So how would you compare those 3 expressions of kind of more than natural powers? Let's put it that way.
Well, I think Vivian's already touched upon it, about the fact that magic is reduced to being a tool for empowerment. And as long as your intentions are good, in other words, relativistic, then you can use those powers legitimately. And you certainly see that. And Philip Pullman deliberately is trying to be the anti-C.S. Lewis. He said as much. J.K. Rowling is a little bit more complex, because at least last time I read, she was a believing Christian of the Church of Scotland. But of course, that a believing Christian of the Church of Scotland is going to be sort of a modernist pseudo-Christian, and I think that comes through in the Harry Potter books, where there's a sort of vague Christianity, but there's illicit means to the purported good end. And then, of course, the Tolkien, he understands his Catholicism. There's this definite difference between that which is natural, that which is preternatural, and that which is supernatural. The powers of Gandalf are angelic. But the powers that are used by Saruman and Sauron are actually the same thing as alchemy, essentially trying to dominate and usurp the power of nature in order to dominate and usurp power over men.
Mm-hmm. I think that sums it up pretty well.
All right, then I have an add-on question to you 2 literary scholars here. You've talked about in Tolkien the preternatural powers, the Eldila, the Inns, and so on. In The Lord of the Rings, is there any supernatural power?
Well, it is, but very subsumed insofar as that we know from elsewhere that Gandalf is a Maiar, who's an angelic being. But you wouldn't know that from the text of The Lord of the Rings. You know that extra textually if you read other parts of Tolkien's legendarium. So if you're informed extra textually, as opposed to extraterrestrially, then you'll know that when Gandalf says at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, when he's fighting the Balrog, who's also an angelic but a demon, when he says, "I'm a servant of the secret fire," Tolkien says elsewhere, and I believe also in one of his letters, that the secret fire is the Holy Spirit. But you only know that if you've got this extra textual dimension going on. You wouldn't necessarily know that purely from the text of the Lord of the Rings taken by itself.
I think that there's also the implied existence of the supernatural God, in that no matter what evil is trying to do in the world, something greater than evil is also at work that ultimately triumphs. And so, but that's an implied thing, but that's actually more like our world,
reality.
Right?
That's
it's
right.
more like reality, that God is real. He's constantly doing good, because that's all God can do, is good. And no matter how much evil intent is going on in the world, good is going to come. And we might have to be engaged in the struggle, and that's actually bringing about our good, our purification, our perfection, and so, but to have this confidence that Tolkien puts in The Lord of the Rings, which I think is to help us have confidence, is that, no, God creates, God is good, whatever is trying to mess that up isn't going to win.
Yeah, it's completely and utterly encapsulated by the words of Samwise Gamgee. And one of the darkest moments in their work, as they're entering Mordor, he says, "Above all shadows rides the sun." I mean, that as a metaphor is exactly it. Above all evil, there is the light, and the light is God himself. And of course, it is the light of Galadriel in that file, which actually, again, from the Silmarillion, is angelic light that staves off the demonic Shelob. So yeah, it's there. There's miraculous powers from God, but it's all in no more overt than the miraculous powers from God we see perhaps in Marian apparitions in our world.
So I agree that there's no intratextual explicit reference to God of the supernatural, but that it is clearly implied. And unlike a Greek tragedy or comedy where Moira or fate is kind of overseeing all things, I've marked them in my copy of this thing. And there's often references to, we're part of a story.
Yes.
Well, you can't be an historian unless the storyteller.
That's right.
Exactly.
Or the idea of providence. I mean, the hope, the secure and certain hope that yes, good will prevail. I mean, that's not materialism. That's not fate. That's belief in a higher power who's in charge.
Because the question, who is the Lord of the Rings? Who is the Lord?
Wow.
You've got people trying to be Lord, but are they really?
Right.
And in the end,
yeah, you're right.
Right?
The ultimate Lord of the Rings is the Lord himself.
That's right.
Although the Lord of the Rings, Sauron thinks he's the Lord of the Rings, ultimately he isn't. That's absolutely it. And then just to remind ourselves, I say this so many times and I'll never tire of saying it, the authorial authority, Tolkien himself said, the Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So our job is to work out how, because the author knows it, he wrote it, right? Our question is the quest to discover that dimension to the work.
Well, I have often used the metaphor of a kaleidoscope. Do they still exist? When I was a kid, you had these things, you look through them, and they had all different kinds of patterns. But what you had inside was broken glass, right? But as you twisted it, you got different patterns. Well, I think what Tolkien did, not intentionally did this, but this is what happened, is you took the fullness of Catholic truth, the sacraments, God, the incarnation,
angels,
angels, apostles, and he broke those up into shards and spun around the kaleidoscope and made different patterns. But what's the way bread after all? Why is the fellowship inaugurated on December 25th? Why are they at Mount Doom on March 25th, or is it vice versa? One of the two, anyway.
Rings destroyed on March 25th. They leave Rivendell on December 25th.
Okay, yeah, and just a coincidence, right?
But I also like to caution people when they start looking for these connections and relationships and whatever, that some of it obviously the author is conscious of and doing deliberately. But if all of that is part of the author's interior life and the way he sees reality, a lot of it is coming out in the story almost unconsciously. Like, I know when I'm writing myself, I'll get several pages in and I go back and I realize, wow, look at that metaphor. And at the time that I was writing, I wasn't even really aware I was making a metaphor, but all of that is the raw material that I'm using to create a story or just tell a story. And so yes, Tolkien has this both deliberate and conscious, but then also just who he is and unconscious. And then let's not forget that the Holy Spirit of God himself is the one writing the world. He's writing the world. And we're part of the story he's writing. So
to actually, again, to continue that quote from Tolkien, which completely and utterly accentuates what you just said, the complete quote from Tolkien is the Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously at first, consciously in the revision. So, it's the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's was the conscious part, but the actual storytelling itself was unconscious. And you are correct. There's sometimes, when even someone like me that can't write anywhere near as well as Tolkien, sometimes you read something you've written and you can't believe you wrote it because it's so good. And the point is, that's because there is a dimension, that is supernatural. There's the gifts coming in. And that's why it's not, if we were too conscious, we would not actually write as well, because we've got to let the Holy Spirit, we've got to let the grace do the work, right?
Well, so like Lewis also, they thought that some people thought, well, he wanted to write morality tales for children, so he had these concepts in mind, and he created a story. No, he said, I had an image. I had an image of a snow falling by a lamppost, or Paralandra. I had an image of island floating on the sea.
You're talking about Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought Lewis and Narnia up, because he too, like Tolkien, of course we know they were friends, he too gets the magic right in his stories. And if you look carefully at this very careful distinction, preternatural, supernatural, who are the beings exercising which powers, because that's their nature to do so, and who are the beings usurping powers in order to be Lord and master over others. And he's got it right too. And a lot of these people getting onto the fantasy bandwagon, they are confused. They are spiritually confused. They are morally confused. It comes out in their work, and it helps to be discerning if you're a parent of children. Yes, read this essay to help you be more discerning in picking literature.
Read the Lord of the Rings, read the Chronicles of Narnia, but tread very carefully elsewhere.
It's true. You must.
And let them be a model or something against which you measure everything else, because of the way they've done this. And then not only that, but it wasn't as if Lewis and Tolkien were just great writers. I mean, fiction, but they wrote essays and they reflected on things. And Lewis and Tolkien's on fairy tales, and Lewis is on stories, crystallizes this, and conceptualizes it, which is a much weaker form.
Yeah.
But at least you know that it wasn't simply by chance that they did what they did.
That's right. In fact, I highly recommend.
Sorry, Vivian.
I was just going to say, I highly recommend people look those up on stories.
I was actually going to say, as you give me the opportunity to promote the subscribe part of my personal website. I'm currently doing going through Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, Tolkien's philosophy of myth, and we've just recorded part 6. So if anybody wants to go deeper, then that's one place they can do it.
Is that an advertisement?
Or an advertisement?
That was a commercial break.
What is the correct pronunciation, Joseph? Is it advertisement or advertisement?
It's advertisement, obviously, Father. You knew that.
Well, I remember my father used to work for Pan American Airways, which was international only at the time. It didn't travel, within the United States. And so I was in college and I wanted to visit England for the very noble purpose of watching a basketball game. No, of only going to England to get back to New York so I could watch a basketball game with Santa Clara University. And it was almost called a ferry flight, not F-A-E-R-I-E, but F-E-R-R-Y, which is an empty flight going from going from London to New York. And a bunch of these English stewardesses were there. And they talked about, that's a missile. I said, missile? That's a missile. Well, no. Well, how do you say projectile? Projectile. Well, how do you say automobile? Motor car. They were to stick to their pronunciation.
Susanna still tells all of her friends that after 20 years, she's still learning English as a second language. So there we are.
There you go.
All right. Well, let's continue a little bit here. The next, by the way, but to sum up, as you both have done well, but I'll say my part here is that this is a good analysis of what magic really is, the false form and the true form. And so I think for magic in literature, this is the lodestone. You should read this. And all right, the next chapter is on the new prudery. And I have nothing to say about this.
Well, I have in theory loads, but I can say as much as we like. So, but I'll defer
say something.
Well, as a nice segue from the last piece to this one, on the top of his list of elements of the new prudery is the child must never read fairy tales or be allowed to hear about fairies, right?
Yes.
And so that makes you really step back. Like, what does that have to do with prudery? What what is he talking about? The child must never hear of the very existence of fighting in any form. The child must be strictly guarded from the shameful rumor that there's such a thing as religion or religious beliefs. He's saying this is the new prudery, this kind of cutting off the child from reality. And people will say, well, wait a minute, how is cutting a child off from fairy tales cutting the child off from reality? Because any fairy tale worth its salt is actually ultimately going to be about the ultimately real. And to prevent children to engage in these things is literally to make that child now vulnerable to propaganda.
But Chesterton is talking about 1934, around there here. Is this kind of prudery happening today? And if so, in what form?
This is basically what he's talking about here with this new prudery or the new Puritans, is the cancel culture.
Yes.
It's actually very prophetic of where we are almost 90 years later. The pure Puritan is not so grim and negative and repressive as the pure progressive, he says in the first paragraph. And at the end of that paragraph, that the Puritans were like perfect freedom compared with the terrorism and rigidity of its new taboos. And then again on page 235, beginning of that new paragraph there, the intellectual interest of this bit of bigotry lies in this, that the new philosophies and new religions and new social systems cannot draw up their own plans for emancipating mankind without still further enslaving mankind. I mean, this is a work of prophecy about the cancel culture. He could see that progressivism was a type of Puritanism, and it would cancel anything which was contrary to its religion.
That's right.
But what kind of cultural inhibitions are there, exhortations for you as a parent, both of you as parents? What are you trying to protect your children from? What does the world tell you? He's saying it was fairy tales and fighting and religion. But what is it now?
It is still those things, actually.
Not fairy tales?
Yes. So, for example, the Common Core educational movement, or whatever you want to call it, they wanted to gut. Now, I don't object to teaching math and science. Of course not. Math and science are useful things. But they were deliberately gutting literature and fiction as being not useful and replacing those titles with nonfiction as if that were superior. And taken a step further, I read a column in the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago, a school teacher who showed up to get the books for her class, and the storeroom with all the books, all the literature that she'd been using to teach the last couple of decades was gone. And all she could get was nonfiction tracts on racism and other forms of prejudice and capitalism and all these things. And she actually asked, what happened to all the literature? Oh, we're not teaching that anymore. You can't give people fiction that will actually get them to explore what it means to be a human being. We just need to indoctrinate children into this new religion, this cancel culture.
People are not allowed to think outside the ideological box. And obviously the humanities enable them to do that, give them the tools to do that. So if you want people to be ideologically brainwashed, you have to take away the tools with which they can question the ideologies. So it makes absolute sense that the past and that all the fruits and benefits of the past have to be cancelled. They have to be got rid of, so we can have this tabula rasa with which they can write on the brains of our children.
Well, I remember having this thought years ago, post-television and prior internet, that we watched, and at that time, they said the average amount of hours per day spent before television, it was 8. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I know people spent a lot of time. We had TV dinners, especially prepared so you could eat while watching television. The point is, a television screen is a box, right? And it's a box which almost totally excludes the supernatural. I mean, you can create any kind of a story you want, an interworldly story, and make it come out any way you want. But how many times did we see someone praying? Or, it's not exciting to watch, I suppose, but I mean, how often do we see the transcendent side of life being presented on this very limited screen? Very rarely. And so I think there was almost a implicit constraint on education by the television, where you're only allowed to see things which could be presented in a very material way. Now, the positive side of that was that I remember I used to watch movies. When there was a war movie, you always had a Catholic chaplain if there was a religious person in it at all. Why is that? Well, it's visual, right? And the church has sacraments, and they got vestments, and incense and candles. Whereas, our good brothers and sisters of Protestant, they got a Bible, but it's not as cinematically, effective as having all the other accoutrements. Anything more on the new prudery?
Well, I think we're probably there.
All right. Well, in that case, we will next week discuss several essays, or at least one, beginning with On the Return of the Barbarian. And this is Lewis in 1934 talking about Hitler. And is he a prophet or not? Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, everyone. God bless you all. We'll see you next week at the Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.